Welcome to Part 3. As a recap, Part 1 served as an introduction where some terms were defined, examples were given, and the introduction of the series was established. Part 2 was concerned with the religious experience as a belief-forming disposition which suggests that the belief that God exists is a basic belief. Note that Part 2 was not an argument for God's existence, but rather suggested that religious experience formed a disposition to accept the belief that God exists, which is in of itself basic and therefore justified. It is here in Part 3 that I will begin to argue for God's existence by means of religious experience. Specifically, this first argument was initially constructed by an atheist, William Rowe, with the intent to eventually argue against religious experience by modifying the premises. Now more on that in a moment. However, it seems to me that Rowe's objection is in actuality, is flawed, and thus I believe that his initial argument stands and can be convincing. Now, Rowe's initial argument reads as follows. You can follow in the description. Premise 1. When subjects have an experience that they take to be of X, it is rational to conclude that they really do experience X unless we have positive reasons to think their experience delusive. Premise 2. Experiences occur which seem to their subjects to be of God. Premise 3. There are no good reasons for thinking that all or most experiences which seem to their subjects to be of God are delusive. Premise 4. It is rational to believe that at least some experiences which seem to their subjects to be of God really are experiences of God. Thus, conclusion. Premise 5. Therefore, it is rational to believe that God exists. Now, Premise 1 states the principle of credulity, which will be the premise that Rowe changes in his challenge against the argument from religious experience. Now note, the principle of credulity was defended in Part 1. Premise 2 states a proposition that no informed person can deny, says Rowe, because all the premise is saying is that it seems to some people that they have experiences of God as their object. Premise 2 would be an example of an incorrigible belief, which are basic via foundationalism. The key here is that an incorrigible belief describes something that seems to be of X, even if X is not true. X does not have to be actually true, for an incorrigible belief is about perception. In other words, a belief is incorrigible if the subject holding the belief could never be in a position to correct it or be mistaken about it. Thus, one cannot argue that the subject is wrong in his perception because such a perception is a first-person event, not a third-person event. Next, Rowe suggests that he is unaware of any argument that disqualifies Premise 3. He states that we do not infer that all religious experiences are delusive from occasional misleading experiences. Now see Part 2 for further clarification on that point. And so he thinks even if many religious experiences appear questionable, it hardly follows that all of them in the whole of history are delusory. For typical objections to Premise 3 and versions of it, see Part 5 of this series. Now, since Premises 4 through 5 are inferences from the first three, Rowe concludes via his initial argument that if just one person has a genuine experience of God, it follows that God exists. But remember that Rowe constructed this argument to eventually serve as a hesitation against arguments from religious experience. In his next move, Rowe decides to revise Premise 1 from its original form to, when subjects have experience they take to be of X, and we know how to discover positive reasons for thinking their experiences are delusive, if such reasons do exist, then it is rational to conclude that they really do experience X, unless we have some positive reason to think their experiences are delusive. Now, the key difference between the revised wording and the original wording of Premise 1 is that the original wording stated that any out-directed religious experience is innocent until proven guilty, and thus the burden of proof is placed on the person who rejects the religious experience. Rowe's revised wording suggests that people who have religious experience do not know how to discover positive reasons for thinking their experience is delusive, if there were any. Here, Rowe implies that there are important differences between sensory and religious experience, namely the presence of checking procedures, what he calls, for sensory experience. For example, photography, asking another witness if they see something, etc., and the absence of checking procedures for religious experience. Therefore, religious experience via the revised premise is guilty until proven innocent. Here, it wouldn't hurt to reiterate that Rowe admits that the original argument from religious experience is a strong argument for God's existence. So, if there are good reasons to reject his revised premise, then instead of weakening religious experience as an argument for God's existence, Rowe does the opposite. Now, going back to Rowe's distinction between checking procedures for sensory experience but not religious experience, this seems flawed to me. To illustrate this point, let's take Rowe's checking procedures and apply them to seeing a piece of pizza on a kitchen table. First, the addition of checking procedures seems to suffer from a serious problem. Suppose we take a picture of a pizza because we are unaware if we could trust our sense of perception of the pizza. However, this checking procedure does not allow us to trust our sense experience, because in order to see if our sense experience is trustworthy, we would have to trust our sense experience of the picture. But if we couldn't trust our direct experience of the pizza, then how are we justified in trusting the direct experience of the picture of the pizza? Or consider another checking procedure of asking a witness if they see the pizza. In attempting to discover whether sense experience is trustworthy or not, how could we know that the witness's sense perception of the pizza is any more trustworthy than our own sense experience? Concisely, the problem with such checking procedures is that they result in the problem of an infinite regress. We would need checking procedures for all our checking procedures. Thus, Roe is either trapped by an infinite regress, or he needs to accept that sense experience is a trustworthy experience via the principle of credulity, that being the original wording of premise 1. Second, ignoring the seemingly acceptable premise of credulity for a moment, it would be erroneous to believe that theists do not have checking procedures. For example, believers could get together and compare notes of their different experience, which would be the procedure of witness. Or believers could see if their experiences contradict previous historical experiences, for example, the writings of the New Testament authors, or via the scriptures, which would be the procedure of coherence. Thus, even if one were to accept Roe's revised premise in light of the regress problem, there remain several checking procedures available for the theist. However, I believe that there needs to be some point where one simply trusts the experience for what it is, instead of requiring lists of checking procedures, and thus the principle of credulity and the original wording of premise 1 seems appropriate to me. Third, sense experience and religious experience are not as radically different than some may think. Rather, there is a close analogy between sense experience and religious experience via direct perception. Direct perception theory of sense experience details the view that the objects we see in reality are in actuality the things in the world. Likewise, a direct perception theory of religious experience details a similar view in that God is either directly experienced or apprehended by a non-sensory form of seeing. Thus, direct perception suggests that since sense experience is usually cognitive and vertical, then likewise religious experience is usually cognitive and vertical, and therefore God is a better causal explanation than some other hypothesis. Now quickly, there are 7 features of religious perception that are recorded in the description that meet the same features of sensory perception. Moreover, there are at least 7 tests that are helpful in distinguishing true from false perceptions of God, namely 1. Internal coherence, 2. Similarity, 3. Associated features, 4. Just consequences for perceiver, 5. Just consequences for others, 6. Genuine and seriousness of experience, and 7. Finally, coherence via scripture, which further allot the clarity of religious experience. Keep in mind that I'm not suggesting that all religious experiences are indeed vertical, but rather that we can either use the presence of checking procedures or the aforementioned tests of religious perception to discover whether religious experiences are indeed vertical. Thus, I would suggest that Roe's original argument is a good one for God's existence for your religious experience. This ends part 3. The next section will deal with another argument from religious experience, which argues that religious experience serves as first principles in epistemology and are prima facie justified. Thanks.